The knife was already at Vesper Moroi's throat when Liora Holloway walked through the door. She had not meant to be there. She had a keycard to the 42nd floor of Moroi Enterprises, because her father's company held a contractual arrangement with the building, because she needed to retrieve signed documents before the morning courier run, and because she had made the catastrophically ordinary mistake of working late on a Tuesday. She had not meant to step into a boardroom that smelled of lightning and old iron, had not meant to witness what no human being was supposed to see, had not meant to find herself frozen in a doorway, with her leather satchel still on her shoulder and her eyes locked on something that rewrote every assumption she had ever made about the world she lived in. Vesper stood at the center of the room, with his back against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline burning gold and indifferent behind him. He was exactly as she had seen him in board meetings and charity galas, tall and impossibly composed, his white hair swept back from a face that belonged in a Baroque portrait rather than a corporate building. His pale skin caught the light the way marble does, cold and luminous, and his dark eyes were steady even now, even with the man in front of him pressing a blade to his jaw that glowed with something that was not a natural metal, something that pulsed with carved symbols and a faint blue fire. The man holding the knife was older in bearing if not in appearance. He wore a charcoal suit that looked as expensive as Vesper's, but there was something rotted beneath the elegance, something that reminded Liora of beautiful fruit left too long in a warm room. His hair was dark and slicked back, his skin similarly pale, and his smile was the kind of smile that had practiced itself into cruelty over a very long time. 412 years, the man said, and his voice was smooth and theatrical, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment. And you still insist on playing the Honorable Duke. It is almost charming, Redden. Vesper's voice did not shake. It never shook. Liora had noticed that about him in the months since her father had introduced them, the absolute refusal of his voice to betray fear. Remove the blade. Whatever grievance you carry, this is not the forum. This is precisely the forum. You built your empire here, in the human world, in their glass towers, hiding behind their laws and their business arrangements. It is fitting that your blood law debt is called here as well. Liora did not breathe. She stood utterly still, her hand on the doorframe, and she understood with the particular clarity that extreme danger produces that she had just stepped into something ancient and enormous, that the two men in this room were not men at all, and that the knife pressed to Vesper Moroi's jaw was one of the things in this world that could actually kill him. Then Vesper's eyes found her, even with a blade at his throat, even with 4 centuries of rivalry pressing against him, in the form of a smiling, dangerous enemy. His eyes found her in the doorway, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear for himself. Something far worse, something that looked like the particular dread of a person who had just watched something they care about step into a trap. Liora, he said very quietly, leave. Reedon turned to look at her, and his smile widened into something that made her stomach drop. Oh, Reedon said. The Holloway girl, how convenient, how very, very convenient. She did not leave. She probably should have. Every rational instinct she possessed told her to back out of the doorway, to run for the elevator, to get as far from the 42nd floor as her legs would carry her. But Liora Holloway had not built herself into the youngest senior partner in her father's consulting firm by abandoning people when the situation became difficult. And she did not start now. She stepped fully into the room and let the door swing shut behind her. "I see you have a scheduling conflict," she said to Vesper, her voice steady in a way she was quietly proud of. "Do you want me to call security, or is this something you would prefer to handle internally?" The corner of Vesper's mouth moved in what was almost a smile. Redden laughed. It was not a pleasant sound, a human with nerve. How refreshing and how useful. He did not move the blade from Vesper's throat, but his attention had split, and Liora watched Vesper's posture shift by the smallest fraction, calculating, the way she had seen him shift in negotiations when a new variable entered the room. "You see, Miss Holloway, your presence here is either the worst luck of your short little life, or the best. That depends entirely on how cooperative Vesper chooses to be." "Put the blade down," Liora said. Redden blinked at her as though she had done something genuinely surprising. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he said. "I am neither," she said. "I am a woman who has read enough contract law to know that whatever debt you believe you are owed, threatening someone in a building with 47 active security cameras is a remarkably poor way to collect it." Redden's smile thinned. "The cameras on this floor have been dark for the last 20 minutes. The backup system in the northeast stairwell has not," she said, which was a complete fabrication. But she said it the way she said everything she needed people to believe, with the calm certainty of a woman reading from a document. Silence. Then Redden pulled the blade back 2 inches, and in the space that created, Vesper moved. He was faster than anything she had seen move in her life. One moment he was against the window, and the next he had Redden's wrist in his hand. The blade redirected, and Redden's arm bent at an angle that should have broken it. The two of them struggled in a blur that her eyes could not entirely track, furniture scraping the floor, the window behind them groaning from the force of 2 bodies that had more strength than any human frame should contain, and then it was over. Redden was across the room with his back against the opposite wall, and Vesper was standing between them, between Liora and Redden, and the blade was in Vesper's hand now. Vesper was breathing hard, which she had not expected. She had somehow assumed that whatever he was did not require breath. But there it was, the slight elevation in his chest, the only outward sign that anything had cost him anything at all. "The blood law," Vesper said, and his voice had changed. It was lower now, the corporate smoothness stripped back to something older and more dangerous. "I acknowledge the debt. I deny your right to collect it unilaterally. You will bring your claim before the Conclave, Redden. That is the old world code, and you know it. Use it!" Redden straightened his jacket with the careful dignity of a man who had almost lost badly and was choosing not to acknowledge it. "The Conclave," he said, "will side with me. They always side with the older blood. Then you have nothing to fear from presenting your case to them." Vesper set the blade on the boardroom table without taking his eyes off Redden. "Go." Redden went, but as he passed through the door, he looked at Liora one more time, and what she saw in his expression was not anger. It was assessment, the calculating look of someone filing her away for later use, and it sat badly in her chest long after the door closed. The room was very quiet. Liora set her satchel on the boardroom table beside the strange blade with its glowing symbols, took a slow breath, and looked at Vesper Moroi. "Blood law," she said. "Blood law debt, Conclave. You are going to explain all of that to me?" He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable, and she could see him turning options over, could see the calculation happening behind his expression, the same calculation she had watched him perform in rooms full of bankers and lawyers and rivals, and she let him see that she was not frightened, that she was not going anywhere, that she intended to understand what she had just walked into. "Yes," he said finally, "I am going to explain it to you, but not here." He picked up the blade from the table with a careful, deliberate movement and tucked it inside his jacket. "And first, you are going to come with me somewhere safe." She raised an eyebrow. "Safe? From what exactly?" "From Redden, who now knows that a human heiress walked into the middle of a centuries-old dispute and was not afraid of him. Which makes you either a tool he will try to use against me, or a threat he will try to remove. Either way." He crossed the room to where she stood and stopped close enough that she could see the faint iridescent quality of his skin, the way it was too perfect to be entirely real. "You cannot go home tonight, not until I have spoken to the Conclave and had certain protections put in place." She considered arguing. She considered pointing out that she did not know him well enough to simply go wherever he directed, that they had shared professional pleasantries and 3 formal dinners, with her father present, and exactly 1 conversation about Flemish Baroque art that had lasted far longer than the event required, that none of that constituted trust in any conventional sense. But she had also just watched him put himself between her and a creature with a glowing blade, without hesitating for a single second, and she was not the kind of woman who ignored data simply because it complicated her worldview. "All right," she said, "but I want answers, real ones. Not whatever carefully edited version you think I can handle." Something warm moved through his dark eyes, brief and startling. "Real ones," he agreed. "I promise you that." He owned a building that did not appear on any public record, which she supposed made sense once she understood what she was dealing with. It was not a glass tower. It was a narrow townhouse in a part of the city where the streets still had cobblestones preserved under their asphalt, and when Vesper pressed his palm to what looked like a perfectly ordinary wooden panel beside the door, a larger door swung inward to reveal a staircase going down. The space beneath was nothing like the word basement suggested. It was enormous, vaulted, the ceilings curving into arches supported by stone pillars that looked genuinely old, not decoratively old, not the architectural revival that filled expensive hotels, but actually old, as though the building above had been constructed around a space that had existed for centuries before it. The walls were lined with shelves of books that had their titles in at least 4 languages she could identify, and several she could not. There was a fireplace large enough to walk into that held a fire that burned with unusual intensity, and the furniture was deep and upholstered in dark velvet, and the whole space smelled of old paper and sandalwood, and something else, something she could not name, but that she would have called cold light if pressed. She sat in one of the chairs near the fire, because her legs had finally decided to register what the rest of her had been holding together through sheer determination, and she let herself breathe properly. For the first time since the boardroom, Vesper remained standing, which she had expected. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back in front of the fireplace, and in the light he was strikingly, unsettlingly beautiful in the way that very old, very dangerous things sometimes are. "How much do you know?" he asked. "I know that you and the man in the boardroom are vampires," she said. "I know that the blade he had was not a normal blade. I know that a bloodlaw debt is something serious enough to warrant cornering someone with a weapon that could apparently do real damage to someone like you. I know that the Conclave is some kind of court or governing body. I know that Redden is older than you, which based on what he said means he was turned before you. which means you are not young by any measure I have available." She paused. "That is what I know. I want to know what I am missing." He sat down across from her, which surprised her. She had expected him to remain standing, to keep the physical distance that would give him control of the room. Instead, he sat down, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something careful and almost relieved, as though someone had finally asked a question he had wanted to answer for a long time. "Redin Voss," he said, "is 603 years old. I am 467. In the world of what we are, the gap between those numbers matters enormously. He was a lord in his human life, and he has carried that arrogance through every century since his turning. When I was made, 467 years ago, there were different courts, different hierarchies, different laws. I was young by our reckoning, and I made a choice that put me in Redin's debt under a blood law that is so old it predates written records of our kind." "What choice?" she asked. "I sheltered someone he had claimed as property," Vesper said, and something darkened in his expression. "A woman, a human woman who had been taken by Redin as a blood asset, which is what certain of our kind call a human being they intend to keep and feed from indefinitely without consent. I hid her. I helped her escape. Under the blood law of that era, that interference constituted a taking of his property, which created a debt he has not collected in 400 years, because the conclave that governed us at the time agreed that his claim on the woman was itself unlawful, and so his blood law right was suspended. Not cancelled." Liora sat with that for a moment. "He has been waiting 400 years to call that debt. He has been waiting for the right moment. The conclave's composition changes. Different ancient families hold seats. The current assembly is more traditional in its interpretation of old-world codes, and Redin believes the climate has shifted in his favor." "And if the conclave rules in his favor," she asked, "what does the blood law debt actually require of you?" The pause before he answered was small, but she caught it. "Service," he said, "or surrender of something of equivalent value to what I took, and what he took, in his view, was a blood asset, a human being, yes." She understood the implication. She understood it clearly, and she sat with it without flinching, because flinching was not useful, and understanding the actual threat was. "He looked at me the way he did," she said, "because I am an heiress. Because taking me would hurt you and fulfill the debt simultaneously." Vesper's jaw tightened. "I will not allow that. I know you will not," she said, and she meant it without performance. "But I want to understand why he believes he could. Does he think I mean something to you? We have only known each other for 4 months. 6 months, Vesper said very quietly. "Since the October Gala. You argued with the museum director about the provenance of a Vermeer for 45 minutes, and you were entirely correct about all of it." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The fire cracked and settled between them. "You have been paying attention," she said. "I have been paying a great deal of attention," he said, "and evidently Redin's intelligence network has noted it. Which is how he knew that bringing you into that room would make me more careful, more constrained, less able to act with the full freedom I would otherwise have." She leaned back in the chair and crossed her arms. Not defensively, she was thinking, processing the architecture of the situation. "So he used me as a constraint on you, but what he actually found was that I neutralized his camera advantage. You bluffed him." "I did." "You bluffed a 600-year-old vampire with a glowing blade. He was theatrical. People have more ego invested in appearances than in reality. I used the appearance. Vesper made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Liora. Yes, you walked into that room, you saw what we are, and you used it. He shook his head slowly. Most humans who have seen what you saw tonight either faint, run, or spend the next several days in a state of categorical denial. I am not most humans, she said, which was a simple statement of fact and not arrogance. What happens at the Conclave, he explained. The Conclave was the governing body of vampire society in the Western world. 12 seats held by the oldest families, located in a chamber beneath a Viennese palace that had not been on any tourist map since 1887. They met when called by any member of sufficient rank. Redden had that rank, Vesper had that rank, and the call could be made within 72 hours, which meant they had 3 days. The blood law debt would be examined, arguments presented by each party, and the 12 would vote. If the vote went to Redden, Vesper would be required to provide restitution equivalent to what he had taken, and the assessment of equivalence was made by the Conclave itself. Can they compel you? She asked. If I refuse a Conclave ruling, I am declared outlaw. Every vampire of standing is required by ancient vow to act against me. It is, he said carefully, a fate equivalent to death for our kind. We cannot survive without the network, without the old world protections. A vampire declared outlaw becomes prey. She turned this over. So the Conclave matters. The Conclave is everything. Then you need to win it, she said. What is your argument? Walk me through it. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something layered and warm and slightly stunned, and then he did something she had not expected. He smiled. Not the controlled, professionally calibrated smile she had seen in board meetings. A real one, brief and genuine, that changed his face entirely and made him look, for just a moment, like someone who had not been carrying centuries of weight. You want to help me prepare a legal argument, he said. I want to understand the case, and I want you to win it, she said. Those are the same thing. Talk. They talked until 3 in the morning. She cross-examined him on every aspect of the original incident, on the blood law, as it had been worded in the 15th century, on the subsequent Conclave rulings that had modified it, on the current composition of the 12 and their known philosophical positions. She took notes on her phone, and then, when he offered her a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen with the air of someone who found digital note-taking vaguely distressing, she switched to that instead and was privately pleased by the quality of the pen. He had centuries of memory to draw from. She had pattern recognition and the ability to find the structural weakness in any argument, which was what she did for a living, and together they built something that looked, by 3 in the morning, like a case that could actually win. At some point he had gone to his kitchen and returned with tea that was inexplicably perfect, and she had drunk it without asking how he knew how she took it, because some things you simply accept when the alternative is losing the thread of an important argument. He showed her to a guest room that was furnished with the kind of careful comfort that suggested he had thought about it in advance. Not tonight, but before, as though some part of him had known this would happen eventually. She did not comment on it. She lay in the large, dark bed and looked at the stone ceiling and thought about the way he had said her name in the boardroom, the way he had moved to put himself between her and Redden without any hesitation whatsoever, and she thought about the October Gala and the Vermeer, and she thought about the way the firelight had caught the planes of his face when he smiled, and she acknowledged to herself, honestly, that she was in a great deal of trouble that had nothing to do with Raiden Voss. She slept. She woke to find that he had arranged for her clothes from her apartment, apparently. By some method she did not to interrogate too closely. And there was breakfast, and there was the journal on the table with all her notes intact, and there was a message on her phone from her assistant, confirming that she had a family emergency and would not be in for 3 days. "You arranged all of this while I slept," she said. "I do not sleep," he said, which was the first explicit acknowledgement of that particular aspect of his nature, offered without drama. "And you needed to be able to move freely without your absence creating concern. You are very efficient. I have had a long time to practice." She looked at him across the breakfast table, in the underground room, the fire still burning, the books watching from their shelves. And she said, "What would you have done if I had not walked in?" He was quiet for a moment. "I would have managed." "That is not an answer." "No," he said, "it is not." He set down his cup, which held something dark that was not coffee, and that she politely did not investigate. "The blade Raiden carried is called a Vosser blade. It is the only thing of my kind that can truly harm another of my kind past the point of recovery. It has been in his family for generations. If you had not come in, had not given me the moment of distraction I needed, I am not certain I would have been able to take it from him without cost. Cost meaning injury. Cost meaning the possibility that this conversation does not happen." She held his gaze. He held hers. Outside the underground room, far above them, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday, and down here 4.5 centuries and 6 months of careful paying attention sat quietly between them like something waiting to be named. "Well," she said, "I am glad I work late." The preparations for the conclave took 2 days, and they were the most unusual 2 days of Liora's life, which was saying something given the competition that now included vampires with glowing blades. Vesper had contacts within the vampire court network who communicated through means that ranged from encrypted digital channels to actual handwritten letters delivered by people who moved with the same uncanny speed he did. And watching him navigate those channels was like watching someone who had spent centuries learning to exist in 2 worlds simultaneously suddenly stop pretending they had not. He introduced her to Cressida, a vampire woman who served as something between a legal scholar and an archivist, who had luminous copper-white hair and wore academic cardigans and spoke with an Eastern European accent that Liora eventually placed as Romanian, which felt appropriate. Cressida reviewed the blood law case with them and agreed that their argument had significant merit, and she looked at Liora with an expression of measured surprise that gradually shifted into something that resembled respect. "She built this argument?" Cressida said to Vesper on the second day, while Liora was examining a 15th century document that Cressida had produced from a case that looked like a violin case and might have been older than the founding of the United States. "She did," Vesper said. "Humans," Cressida said, in the tone of someone making a philosophical observation. "They are remarkable when they are not being catastrophically short-lived." Liora looked up from the document. "I can hear you." "I know," Cress said pleasantly. It was a compliment. On the second night, when Cressida had gone, and the argument was as strong as they could make it, Vesper and Liora sat together in the main room with the fire between them, and the careful professional distance that had governed their interactions for 6 months had quietly dissolved into something else, something that neither of them had fully addressed, but that was present in every exchange, in the way he handed her things, in the way she read his expressions across the room, in the long conversations that kept sliding from legal strategy into something less structured and more honest. "Tell me about being made," she said. It was past midnight, and she had her feet tucked up in the chair and the journal in her lap, and she was not taking notes anymore. She was just asking because she wanted to know. He considered her for a long moment. Most people either never ask or cannot hear the answer without distress. "I am asking." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the fire. It was winter. 1557. I was 23 years old, and I was dying of something the physicians of the time could not name, and which I now understand was a particularly aggressive fever. The vampire who made me was a woman named Vailindra. She was very old. She had known my family for 3 generations, and she made the choice without asking me, because there was no time to ask. He paused. I was angry about that for approximately 40 years. Only 40 years? The corner of his mouth moved. I am a slow processor. After 40 years, I decided that being angry at someone for giving me 4 centuries of additional existence was an inefficient use of eternity. Where is she now? Vailindra? She is gone, he said, and the simplicity of it contained depths she did not press into. I have been my own governance for a very long time. And the Duke title? She asked. Is that from your human life? It is. I was the Duke of Moroi in a small territory in what is now eastern Hungary when I transitioned. I kept it, partly from habit, and partly because in vampire society, your human title is considered part of your identity, the bridge between what you were and what you became. You kept your name too. Vesper, my mother named me for the evening star, he said. She thought I would be a poet. I was a terrible poet. Liora laughed, and it surprised both of them, the easy, natural sound of it in the quiet room, and he looked at her with that warm, startled expression she was beginning to collect, the one that happened when she did something that seemed to reach past the centuries of careful composure. Liora, he said, and the way he said it was different now, softer in the consonants. I need to say something before we go to Vienna, before the Conclave, in case the situation becomes more complicated than we have planned for. Say it, she said. He was quiet for a long moment, collecting words with the care of someone who had lived long enough to know how much the wrong ones cost. In 6 months, he said, watching you in professional rooms and at formal events, and in one conversation about a painting that went on considerably longer than decorum required. I have found myself doing something I have not done in a very long time. Hoping, he met her eyes and did not look away. I am very old, and I have watched many human lives pass, and I am aware of every reason why what I am describing is inadvisable, every disparity in our situations, every complexity in what it would mean for you to be connected to my world. I am aware of all of it, and I find that I cannot stand in front of the Conclave tomorrow without having told you that the reason Redden's gambit worked, the reason I was constrained, the reason he correctly identified you as a point of vulnerability, is that you are a point of vulnerability. You have been since October. She did not speak immediately. She let his words settle, and she thought about all the reasons she could list for caution, for the sensible, maintained professional distance, for the practical reality of what loving someone who measured time in centuries actually meant for a woman who measured it in decades. She thought about all of those things. Then she uncurled from the chair, crossed the room, sat on the arm of his chair, and looked at him from above for the first time, which felt significant in a way she could not quite name but recognized. I have been paying attention since October too, she said. I told myself I was assessing a professional contact. I am apparently a worse liar than I thought. He looked up at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, entirely open, and in 6 months she had not once seen him look like that. And she understood that she was seeing something that cost him, something that did not come easily to a man who had learned over 4 centuries to hold everything behind glass. She put her hand against his jaw, carefully, and he closed his eyes, and the fire cracked and settled, and outside the city turned on its axis, and the moment was very still and very full. "Win the conclave," she said softly. "Then we will discuss the rest." His hand came up to cover hers, and she felt the difference in temperature, the marble cool that was simply what he was. And it did not bother her. It was just him, just Vesper. "Yes," he said. Vienna was cold and grey, and magnificently itself. They flew commercially, which Vesper tolerated with the resigned dignity of someone who considers air travel a minor but persistent modern indignity. And Cressida met them at the airport with a car and the air of a woman who had navigated vampire court politics long enough to find most things mildly tiresome. The palace above the conclave chamber was an actual palace, 18th century, technically a private cultural foundation, and the people who walked its upper floors during daylight hours had no idea that beneath the east wing, behind a wall that required a blood touch to open, there was a staircase leading to a chamber that had held the governance of vampire kind for 600 years. Redden was already there when they arrived. He stood with 2 of his own people, another vampire named Gorine who was broad-shouldered and silent, and a woman Cressida quietly identified as Selavain, who was a blood law scholar of considerable reputation and Reden's apparent legal advocate. Reden looked at Vesper with the calm certainty of a man who believed he had already won, and then he looked at Liora, and his expression shifted into something considered and unpleasant. "You brought the human to the conclave," he said. "That is unexpected." "Miss Holloway is consulting on the legal argument," Vesper said. His hand had moved to the small of her back, a gentle, barely perceptible contact that was also entirely a declaration, the kind of touch that said she is with me in the most complete sense of the phrase, and she felt it land and did not move away. "Her expertise is relevant." Redden smiled. "Of course it is." The 12 members of the conclave were already seated when they entered the chamber. They were arranged in a horseshoe of high-backed chairs. 12 vampires ranging in apparent age from 30 to something she could not guess, all of them with that particular quality of stillness that she was learning to recognize as a marker of extreme age, the kind of stillness that comes from having spent so long practicing patience that it had become structural. They were dressed in the interesting combination of very old formal wear and modern suits that suggested a governing body that had been continuously active long enough to absorb multiple fashion eras simultaneously. She saw white hair and silver, and one woman with hair so pale it was nearly translucent, all of it the marker of what they were. And they watched her entry into the room with 12 pairs of ancient eyes, and she walked steadily and met each gaze and did not flinch. The presiding seat was held by a vampire named Marveth, who was, according to Cressida's quiet briefing, the oldest sitting member at approximately 800 years, and who wore the tired expression of someone who had heard more arguments than any person should be required to hear, across any number of lifetimes. Marveth looked at Vesper and Reden with the patient weariness of an experienced judge, and called the session to order in a voice that carried without volume. Reden presented his case first. Selavain was competent, Liora assessed, with the precision of someone who knew the law extremely well and had chosen to use its most literal interpretation. The blood law debt was real, she argued. The action that created it was documented. The suspension, issued 4 centuries ago, had been a procedural measure, not a cancellation, and the changed composition of the conclave meant the philosophical basis for that suspension no longer held. Redin was owed restitution, and he was entitled to bring his claim. Liora watched the 12 as Selavane spoke. She watched which ones leaned forward and which ones remained expressionless, and which ones exchanged the faintest glances, and she made her assessments and adjusted the argument accordingly in her head, the way she did in every room where decisions were being made, reading the audience, finding the fulcrum. When it was their turn, Vesper spoke first, and he was magnificent. She had known he was capable of presence, had watched him command boardrooms for 6 months, but this was something else. This was 4.5 centuries of accumulated authority, channeled into a precision argument, delivered to people who recognized and respected that authority, and the chamber was very quiet as he spoke. Then he said, "Miss Holloway will address the legal structure of the suspension ruling." Several of the 12 shifted their attention to her. Marveth looked at her with calm curiosity. One of the 12, an old vampire with close-cropped white hair and an expression of particular skepticism, leaned forward. She stood up. She had the journal. She did not need it, but she had it. She made the argument. She walked the 12 through the legal framework, not as it had been applied 4 centuries ago, but as it had been modified by 15 subsequent conclave rulings, each of which Cressida had sourced and she had read, and she demonstrated it, that the suspension of Redin's claim was not a procedural hold, but a substantive ruling, that it had established precedent which had been upheld by 7 of those subsequent rulings, and that the philosophical shift Redin was relying on had not in fact been codified into blood law by the current conclave, meaning it could not retroactively reframe a ruling that had been made under the previous standard. It was a technical argument. It was also a correct argument, and she could see from the way Selavane's expression changed that Redin's advocate knew it too. When she finished, Marveth looked at her for a long moment. "You are human," he said. "I am," she said. "You have read 600 years of blood law precedent. I have read the portions relevant to this case. I read quickly." Marveth looked at Vesper. "She is yours?" "She is her own," Vesper said, with a precision that made something warm move through her chest. "But she stands with me." Marveth nodded slowly. The 12 consulted. It took less time than she had expected, less than 20 minutes, and when they reconvened, Marveth's verdict was delivered with the same tired patience with which he had opened the session. The suspension ruling was upheld. The blood law debt was formally cancelled, not suspended, cancelled, under the precedent she had identified, which had never been properly applied to it. Redin's claim was dismissed. The chamber was very quiet for a moment after that. Then Redin stood up, and she watched his face, and what she saw there was not gracious defeat. It was the compressed fury of someone who had waited 400 years for a moment that had just been taken from him by a human woman with a fountain pen and 6 months of observation. And underneath the fury was something older and colder, and she understood that they were not finished, not really, that a man who carried a grudge for 4 centuries did not simply let it go because of a ruling. Vesper understood it too. She could see it in the way he straightened, the way he placed himself just slightly between her and Redin as they prepared to leave the chamber, Redden spoke one more time before they reached the door. He spoke quietly, as though to himself, but in the silence of the chamber, everyone heard it. "The Conclave has spoken," he said, "but the Conclave is not the only ancient authority." Marvith's voice came from the presiding chair. "Flat and final, Redden Voss, you will remember that making threats in this chamber is its own blood law violation, unless you would dislike to spend the next decade in the Conclave's keeping." Redden smiled his practiced smile and said nothing more and left through the opposite door, Gorin following him, and Celavane gathering her papers with the careful efficiency of a professional who had decided she was not responsible for her client's personal failings. Cressida appeared at Leora's elbow with the quiet efficiency she had become accustomed to. "We should not stay in the chamber. He will not act here, but the streets above are less governed." "I agree," Vesper said. He looked at Liora, and his expression was complicated. Something that was relief and concern, and something else she could not quite name, but that she was fairly certain corresponded to an emotion she recognized in herself. "We move now." They moved. The streets above the palace were wet from a recent rain, the cobblestones gleaming, the sky the peculiar grey of European late afternoon, and Cressida had the car waiting, and they moved quickly. Efficiently, the way people move when they know they are being watched and are choosing not to let it slow them down. They made it 3 blocks. The first indication was the temperature drop, sudden and unnatural, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather. The second was Vesper going absolutely still beside her, and she had learned that his stillness was a form of attention, that he went still the way predators go still. And she went quiet and watchful immediately, her hand finding his forearm without entirely meaning to. Gorin stepped out of an alley to their left, and 2 others she had not seen before stepped from the opposite direction, and then Redden came from directly ahead. And he was not wearing the smile now, and in his hand was the Vossa blade. "No cameras in these streets," Redden said pleasantly. "Old city, old architecture, old rules. This is a violation of Conclave jurisdiction," Cressida said, her voice sharp. "You have just acted against a member of the Conclave's ruling. That is an outlaw offense." "I will accept that consequence," Redden said, and the calmness in his voice was the calmness of someone who had decided they have nothing more to lose, which was the most dangerous state a person of any kind could be in. "I have been patient for 400 years, Vesper. You took something from me. Tonight I will take something from you." He was not looking at Vesper when he said it. He was looking at Liora. Everything happened in a very compressed amount of time. Vesper moved in front of her, and she let him, because she was smart enough to know that between the 2 of them, he was significantly better positioned to deal with a vampire with a glowing blade. She felt his hand reach back and close around her wrist, not pulling her, just holding, maintaining contact, and she could feel through that grip that he was ready to move in any direction. Cressida produced something from her cardigan that was not a blade, but that glowed similarly, and pointed it at Gorin, which appeared to give Gorin immediate pause. Redden moved toward Vesper with the focused intent of someone who had planned this moment across a very long time, and Vesper met him, and the fight was nothing like what Liora had seen in the boardroom. It was faster and harder, and there was a sound when the blade connected with Vesper's side that made her breath go sharp in her chest. He had been cut. She could see it. He did not fall, and he did not retreat, and his expression did not change. But there was a tear in the fabric of his jacket, and something dark beneath it, and she felt a cold fury rise in her that surprised her with its completeness. She was not helpless. She had spent 2 days in a room full of ancient vampire law documents, and among those documents, Cressida had walked her through the emergency protocols of blood law enforcement, which included the specific conditions under which a human witness to a blood law violation could invoke Conclave emergency jurisdiction, which triggered an immediate response protocol, which the Conclave had established precisely because vampires had a tendency to take their disputes into streets and alleys when they did not like rulings. She had memorized the invocation because she had thought she might need it. She used it now. She spoke clearly in the specific formula Cressida had given her, naming the date and the parties and the nature of the violation, and invoking Conclave emergency jurisdiction in her capacity as a credentialed human observer, which was status. Marvith had effectively conferred on her the moment he acknowledged her standing in the chamber. The effect was not instantaneous, but it was fast. Within 90 seconds, there were 4 vampires in the alley who had not been there before, members of the Conclave's enforcement arm, and they were very large and very calm, and they had the particular quality of authority that does not need to make noise about itself. Reddin turned and looked at Liora, and his expression as he took in what she had just done was something she would remember for a long time, that particular look of a person who has underestimated someone catastrophically and knows it. "You have protocols memorized," he said. "I read quickly," she said. The enforcement arm took Reddin and Gorin and the 2 others into custody, which in vampire legal terms meant something she did not entirely want to examine closely, but which Cressida assured her was appropriate. Reddin would face the outlaw tribunal, given that he had attacked under Conclave jurisdiction. In responses to a Conclave ruling, the outcome of that tribunal was not in doubt. And then the alley was quiet, and Cressida was speaking to the enforcement members with crisp efficiency, and Liora turned to Vesper and found him leaning against the alley wall with one hand pressed to his side, and his expression was carefully composed, which was how she knew it actually hurt. She crossed to him in 3 steps and put her hand over the tear in the jacket, and felt the warmth of what was there and tried very hard not to think about it too closely. "How serious," she said. "A Vosa blade cuts deeply," he said. "It will heal. It takes longer for our kind than ordinary wounds." "Several days." "Several days," she said. "It is not fatal." He met her eyes. "I am not in danger of leaving you." She heard what was under that, the particular precision of that phrasing. "I am not in danger of leaving you, not I will recover. Not the wound is minor, but the explicit reassurance directed at the specific fear she had not voiced, and she understood again why she had been paying attention since October. "We are going back to the underground room," she said. "You are going to sit in one of those chairs and not argue with me about it." "I was not going to argue." "Good, Liora." She looked at him. He was pale, paler than usual, which she had not thought was possible, and there was fatigue in his face that she had not seen before. The first visible evidence that 4.5 centuries of composure had not actually made him invincible, and she held that knowledge with a kind of tenderness she had not prepared for. "You used the invocation," he said. "Yes, you were prepared for this." "I prepared for the possibility," she said. "Because you were prepared for the possibility, and I could see it, and I thought someone should have a contingency plan that did not involve standing between me and a blade." He looked at her with the open, unguarded expression she had first seen in front of the fire, the one that cost him, and he said very quietly, "I have not had anyone prepare a contingency plan for me in a very long time." She did not answer with words. She took his hand, carefully, his marble-cool hand, and she held it, and she said, "Let's go home." Home was the underground room. Home was the fire and the bookshelves and the impeccable tea. And Cressida visited briefly to confirm the legal outcomes, which were as clean as they had hoped for. Reedon's outlaw tribunal was convened the following morning in the Conclave's emergency jurisdiction. The outcome was exactly what Cressida had predicted. Reedon Voss was stripped of his standing, his Conclave recognition, and the Vosser blade, which was placed in the Conclave's keeping. He was given 60 days to settle his affairs, and then restricted to a specific territory with conditions attached that made him, in practical terms, no threat to anyone of standing for the foreseeable future. It was as close to justice as 4 centuries of waiting could be made to produce, and it was, Liora thought, enough Vesper healed. Not quickly by her standards, 4 days of something that was not quite rest but was the vampire equivalent, where he was present and thinking and reading but moving less and speaking more slowly, which gave her an extraordinary amount of time to sit in the chair across from him and read his books and have conversations that ranged across philosophy and history and the particular challenges of navigating business law when you had been alive for longer than most of the legal frameworks you operated in. On the 4th day, she was reading a 16th century text on territorial law that she found genuinely fascinating when she became aware that he was watching her rather than his own book. And she did not look up immediately because she wanted to finish her thought. And when she did look up, he was looking at her with an expression that was entirely uncalculated and entirely warm and entirely clear. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said everything he meant, without performance, without preamble, with the directness of a man who had learned over centuries that the things worth saying are better said simply. She set down the 16th century text. "I know," she said. "I love you too. I have been working up to telling you for approximately 3 weeks. His eyebrows rose fractionally. 3 weeks? I required verification of certain feelings before committing to a declaration, she said. I am methodical. You are extraordinary, he said. And it was not flattery, it was an observation, delivered with the same weight he gave to facts. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee rather than the chair across, and he made room for her immediately, naturally, as though she had always belonged there, and she leaned against him and felt the solid, marble-cool reality of him, and thought that the temperature was already becoming simply familiar. There are things we need to discuss, she said, practically. Yes, the world I come from, she said, does not know about vampires. My father does not know. My professional life operates on assumptions that are no longer accurate. All true, he said. What are you thinking? I am thinking that I do not need my world to know what you are. I have a very good capacity for discretion, and so do you, evidently, since you have been operating in plain sight for decades. But I need to understand what it means, long term, the practical shape of it. What would you like to know, she considered. You have watched human lives end. People you cared about? Yes, that is the hardest part, she said. It is, he said, without qualification. I am not asking you for a solution to mortality, she said carefully. I am not asking you to turn me. I want to understand if this is something you can actually do. Love someone who will age, knowing the outcome, because I can ask that of you or I cannot, and I need to know which it is. He was quiet for a long moment. She felt his breathing, even, and slow against her shoulder. "I have not loved anyone in this way," he said, "in a very long time, long enough that the particular fear of loss has been theoretical rather than immediate." He paused. "What I can tell you honestly is that every year with you is a year I would not trade for the safety of distance. That has been true of very few people in 4 centuries. And the question of what comes later is one we can return to when it becomes less theoretical, when you have lived in this knowledge long enough to know what you actually want." She thought about that. It was not a vague deflection. It was the honest acknowledgement that turning was a choice, a permanent and enormous choice, and that it was not one that should be made in the first weeks of a declared love, and she respected the clarity of it. "All right," she said, "that is a reasonable framework. You are remarkably comfortable with ambiguity for someone so methodical," he said. "I am comfortable with ambiguity when I trust the person I am navigating it with," she said. "I trust you." She felt the faint tightening of his arm around her that meant those words had landed somewhere deep. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire burning, the old books watching, the city moving far above them in its ordinary patterns. And Liora thought about 6 months of paying attention, and one night in a boardroom, with a glowing blade and 412 years of a debt that had just been cancelled, and she thought that the shape of her life had changed permanently on a Tuesday evening when she had gone to pick up documents, and had walked instead into something ancient and dangerous and real. She did not regret any of it. The weeks that followed had a texture she had not expected, a mixture of the completely ordinary and the fundamentally extraordinary that was, she supposed, simply what it meant to love someone who existed in 2 worlds simultaneously. She still went to work. She still argued about contracts and advised clients and took calls from her father, who noticed that she seemed different, more settled, and who did not press her for the specific reason. Vesper still ran Moroi Enterprises from the 42nd floor and attended board meetings and presented quarterly reports. And they were careful in public with the same instinct that had kept him safe for decades. But in private, there was no carefulness at all. Only the gradual accumulation of small intimacies and long conversations and the slow, careful architecture of a life being built across 2 very different kinds of time. He taught her things. He had centuries of knowledge in disciplines that had not been formalized when he learned them. And he taught her without condescension, with the pleasure of someone who had waited a long time to share certain things with someone who would genuinely engage with them. She in turn showed him that his assumed expertise in the modern world was more partial than he thought, that there were textures of contemporary life he had observed from a professional distance without fully entering, and she watched him enter them with the particular delight of someone experiencing the genuinely new. He came to dinner at her father's house 6 weeks after Vienna. Her father, Marcus Holloway, was a careful man and a perceptive one, and he had done enough business with Moroi Enterprises to have developed opinions about Vesper, all of which were largely accurate, and none of which included the most fundamental fact. Liora sat at that dinner table and watched her father and the man she loved navigate a conversation, and felt the strangeness of holding a secret that was also, she was beginning to understand, simply a truth that had different timelines for different people, a truth that could wait until it needed to be shared. Her father liked him. He would have said he was reserving judgment, but she knew Marcus Holloway's reserved judgment from his actual reservations, and this was the former. He liked the steadiness, The honesty, the way Vesper listened rather than waiting for his turn to speak. After dinner on the street outside, Vesper had looked at her and said, "He knows something has changed. He does not know what." "He will figure out the important part eventually," she said. "He always does. And the other part, we will handle that when we reach it," she said, which was what he had said to her, and she watched him recognize it and smile. She met Cressida for coffee on a regular basis, which had begun as practical meetings about lingering conclave logistics, and had evolved into something that resembled friendship, which Cressida claimed not to do, but clearly did anyway. Cressida had been navigating the border between human and vampire worlds for 3 centuries, and had opinions about most things, and shared them with a directness that Liora found refreshing. "He has not been like this since before I knew him," Cressida told her one morning. Over espresso she drank purely out of long habit. "And I have known him for 230 years. Liora asked. Cressida gestured with one hand. "Present, here. As though the current moment is worth inhabiting." She looked at Liora steadily. "You should know that in our world, what he is showing you is not common. Vampires of his age tend toward performance. We have practiced our presentations for so long they become us. What he gives you is not practiced." Liora absorbed this. "I know," she said. "I suspected you did," Cressida said. "I am telling you anyway, because someone should." 3 months after Vienna, Marvith himself sent a formal communication to Vesper noting that the Holloway matter, as it was referred to in Conclave records, had been cited as precedent in 2 subsequent rulings, and that Miss Holloway's contribution to blood law jurisprudence had been formally entered into the Conclave's record. It was, Cressida explained, an extraordinary acknowledgement, the first time in 600 years that a human being had been recognized in Conclave records for legal contribution rather than as a subject of proceedings. Vesper read the communication 3 times, which was how she knew he was moved by it, and then he looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that she had come to understand was the most precious thing he had, the thing he gave almost no one, and he said, "You have a permanent mark in our world now." "Good," she said. "I intend to stick around." The declaration of love had not resolved the ambiguity about the future, and they both knew it, and they both let it sit as something to be addressed when addressed, because the present was full enough and honest enough that pressing the distant future felt like ingratitude. But it surfaced, sometimes, in the texture of their late conversations, in the moments when she caught him looking at her with something that was joy and grief at once, the particular ache of loving something you know is finite. One night, 4 months after Vienna, she raised it herself. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the question we agreed to revisit." He did not ask which question. He set down his book. "I am 29, she said. "I am not asking you to make this decision for me, and I am not making it now, but I want you to know that it is on the table, in my mind, as something I am genuinely considering and not something I am avoiding, and I want to know if it is on yours." "It has been on mine," he said carefully. "Since the second week. When you argued with Cressida about the precedent structure for 40 minutes, and then turned to me and said, 'She is right, by the way, adjust the argument,' and went back to your notes." He looked at her. "I thought, this person could exist in my world fully, and then I thought, I should not think that because she did not choose this, and it is not mine to want for her." "But you wanted it." "Yes, then we are aligned," she said. "We are not deciding now. We are deciding that we are genuinely open to deciding. which is different from avoidance. There is process to it, he said. It is not simple. It cannot be undone. I know. I have read everything Cressida's library has on it, which is extensive. He looked at her. You have been doing research. I am methodical, she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her and took both her hands in his and held them with the careful, total attention he gave to things that mattered enormously. And he said, "When you are ready, if you are ready, I will be here, and if you decide differently, I will still be here. However much here I can offer, that is not a romantic declaration," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is an honest one. I prefer the honest one," she said. He kissed her. The first time had been 3 weeks after Vienna, in the underground room with no particular drama attached, just the natural arrival of a moment that had been building since October, and she had discovered that the marble-cool quality of him was simply part of the vocabulary of being close to him, and she had added it to the list of things that were simply and completely Vesper. This kiss was different. That first one, the way a conversation about building something permanent is different from the first time you notice you want to build it. It was quiet and warm and full of everything they had said and everything they had not said and everything they intended to figure out together. The spring arrived, and the city changed its quality of light, and Liora Holloway went to work and built a professional life and loved her strange, ancient, impossibly steady partner, and Vesper Moroi ran his empire and sat in his underground room with his books and watched the human woman who had walked into a boardroom confrontation and not flinched once remake the entire architecture of his centuries. 6 months after Vienna, on a warm evening in May, her father asked her directly. They were on the terrace of his house in Connecticut, the kind of evening that makes questions feel possible, and Marcus Holloway looked at his daughter over his glass and said, "How serious is this?" She thought about the question. She thought about boardrooms and alleyways and Vosa blades and blood law precedent, and Marvith's formal recognition, and the way Vesper said her name in the dark when he thought she might be in danger. "Very," she said. Her father nodded slowly. He was a careful man and a perceptive one. "There is something unusual about him," he said, which was the most delicate possible way to say what he had clearly suspected for some time. "Something I cannot quite locate." "He is," she said, "extraordinary in several ways that I am going to explain to you when the timing is right. What I need you to know now is that he is the most honorable person I have ever encountered, and I intend to spend a very long time with him." Her father looked at her, and she could see him evaluating, processing, deciding to trust her assessment as he had trusted it on professional matters for years. "It's all right," he said. "Bring him to dinner again, properly." She called Vesper from the terrace after her father went inside, and she told him, and she could hear in the brief silence on the line the particular warmth she had come to read in him, the thing that was not quite laughter but was related to it. "A proper dinner," he said, "with wine pairing you will have to manage." "I have navigated considerably worse than a proper Connecticut dinner," he said. "I know," she said. "You managed Reading." "You managed Renin," he corrected. "I mostly bled," she laughed. Standing on the terrace in the May evening, and she loved him with the complete specific particularity of someone who has chosen deliberately rather than fallen accidentally, and the city and the centuries and the ancient complicated world he carried were all part of what she was choosing. And she chose it fully. The dinner happened, and it went well, which was not a surprise. Marcus Holloway was a good reader of people, and what he read in Vesper was what was actually there: the steadiness, the honesty, the enormous care directed at his daughter, and, if he could not entirely locate the quality of him, he was also the kind of man who understood that some things are beyond the frame of the expected without being beyond the frame of the good. After dinner, Vesper and Marcus Holloway stood together on the same terrace where she had talked to her father 6 months earlier, and she watched through the window as they spoke, her father with his careful gestures, and her vampire duke with his centuries of patience, and she thought about trust and time, and the long architecture of honest things. Later, on the drive back to the city, she asked what they had talked about. "Many things," Vesper said. "He asked what my intentions were." She raised an eyebrow. "My father, who considers himself thoroughly modern, asked what your intentions were." "He did. What did you tell him?" Vesper glanced at her with those dark eyes, and in the passing light of the highway they were very warm. "I told him that I intended to spend as long as she will have me taking very good care of her, and that his daughter is the most capable person I have ever encountered across a significant number of years, and that I intended to deserve the time she gives me." She was quiet for a moment. "That was a very good answer," she said. "I thought so," he said, which was not arrogance, just the comfort of a man who had found the right words and knew it. The year moved forward. The conclave remained stable, Cressida's careful monitoring of post-Redan tribunal politics, confirming that the power vacuum had settled without crisis. The blood law precedents established by the Holloway matter continued to be cited. Marvith sent Vesper a private note observing, with the dry humor of a very old man, that the introduction of an actively practicing human legal mind into conclave proceedings had been more disruptive and more beneficial than any single event in the last 50 years, Vesper framed it. She pointed out that framing a conclave communication and putting it on a wall was extremely undignified for a vampire duke. He kept it anyway. She moved into the townhouse in stages, the way practical people move into places they intend to stay, bringing things incrementally, until one morning she arrived and realized she had brought everything, and the apartment she had been paying rent on had been largely empty for 3 weeks. "I seem to have moved in," she said. "You have," he said without looking up from his desk. "When were you going to mention it?" "I was waiting to see if you noticed." She looked around the underground room, which had rearranged itself around her presence so gradually that she had not marked the individual changes. Her books on the shelves beside his, her fountain pen beside his, on the writing table, the particular tea she preferred in the kitchen cabinet alongside whatever dark thing he drank with such complete indifference to human observation. "You rearranged the bookshelves," she said. "You alphabetize by subject discipline rather than by author," he said. "It is a defensible system." "It is the correct system," she said, "but you hate it. I have adapted." She crossed to the desk where he was working and put her hands on either side of his chair and looked at him close up, marble cool and white-haired and ancient and completely, entirely, specifically himself. "I love you," she said. "I have moved in." These two facts are related. He reached up and covered one of her hands with his. "I know," he said. "I love you too. The second fact was not accidental on my end. You were hoping. I told you in September that I had started hoping," he said. "I have not stopped." She kissed him on the forehead because she could, because he was right there, and she could reach him, and she wanted to, and she went to the bookshelves to evaluate the adaptation of her alphabetization system, and found that it had been implemented with remarkable precision. "You put a lot of effort into this," she said. "It took 2 evenings," he said, which for someone who did not sleep meant something substantial. "You are ridiculous," she said. "I have been called worse," he said. She pulled a book from the shelf and settled into her chair by the fire, which was her chair now in the fullest sense, and she read, and he worked, and the fire burned, and the city moved far above them in its ordinary patterns, and in the underground room that was not on any public record, in the space between centuries of history and 30 years of living, in the particular warmth of something chosen and kept. 2 people were home. The question of the future remained open as they had agreed it would, and it would come to its answer in its own time, in the gradual accumulation of days spent in honesty and care, in the conversations that kept circling back to it with more certainty each time, in the knowledge that an open question held with love is not a wound but a door. She was not afraid of it. She had walked into a boardroom with a glowing blade and a centuries-old grudge, and she had not been afraid then either, and she had learned since that the things that mattered most required the same thing. You walked through the door with your eyes open, and you stayed. She stayed. He was there. The fire cracked, and the books watched, and the city turned, and the ancient world and the human world held their complicated, hidden border, and on one side of it and on the other, in the space between them where 2 people had found something true, the evening star burned quietly on,